Coming up next, the Bookening eviscerates Dostoevsky. No. Well, maybe. I don't know. We'll see.
I am wearing his intestines around my neck like a necklace.
What?
Eviscerate means to literally rip the intestines out of something.
The viscera out.
You know what, folks? I'm not even going to play the whole theme song. We're just going to go straight into it, because how can we come back from that? Well, we did famously dig up Mark Twain so we could hit Jane Austen. What did you do to Mark Twain, Jake, in old Bookening lore?
So you could hit him over the head with Jane Austen
over the head with his own shin bone, I think.
His own
Right.
shin bone, yeah.
Yeah. And now we've eviscerated Dostoevsky, and Brandon has made is wearing his guts around his neck.
Like something that stepped out of like a Mad Max movie.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
I'm a Mad Max literary scholar.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. What can I say? I'm awesome.
Well, speaking of...
Sorry. I watched 2001: A Space Odyssey last night, and it was a compromise between Mad Max and a rom-com. And I just had the reality of that play again in my mind, that was somehow the choice, and what a joke.
Somebody has HBO Max.
That's funny.
100%, man.
Hey, I don't know why people knock that. That's a great streaming service.
HBO Max?
Yeah.
It's the best.
I mean, I'm sorry that they're ruining cinema or whatever, but what a entertaining streaming service to have.
What do they have available?
Well, they've got
Turner Classic Movies, so they have everything that's great and classic. Like, not literally everything, but they have so much.
Wizard of Oz, Casablanca, Singing in the Rain, like all that.
It just doesn't matter what if it's
Better
not
than
if it's
Netflix
not owned by
giving it
Disney.
Cancel Netflix yesterday and get this.
If it's not owned by Disney and it's great and classic, they've got it there. They also have a ton, like all the DC catalog. They have a bunch of anime crap.
And it's Warner Brothers, so they just have a nice deep catalog of
like the Studio
mid-range,
Ghibli stuff.
Yeah, they've got Studio Ghibli.
All of it.
But then they've got like just 90s, rom-coms and Mississippi Burning, like just those kinds of things.
Good stuff.
That Netflix, you're like, I can't believe Netflix got the Rainmaker. John Grisham's The Rainmaker. What a quality title. Well, HBO Max is nothing but like its worst is that kind of stuff. Anyway, this podcast is not about HBO Max.
What about Apple Plus?
This podcast is totally about Apple Plus.
Or whatever they call it, Apple TV.
The Apple TV Plus.
Never.
No,
never
it's
paid
not
for
worth it. No.
Their originals are stupid.
Yeah.
The only thing they have right now is I like that Cartoon Saloon studio. They did Wolf Walkers. I wanted to see that.
I don't know what
People that
any
did
of those words mean.
Song of the Sea,
Oh, Song of the Sea.
Breadwinner.
Yeah. That's all on Apple TV Plus?
No, those aren't, but the new one by their studio is.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Gotcha.
Exclusively.
Speaking of exclusive,
Yeah.
this podcast was supposed to be exclusively about the Brothers Karamazov, but we're 2 minutes in and we've gone completely off the rails.
I don't want to talk about this book.
Brandon, I was so proud of our first episode. Like, we got on topic quickly.
Yeah.
You remember when we tried to read, what was it that we did recently? 1984.
Yeah.
Those were some long introductions.
They were.
Where nothing remotely literary happened.
There are some crows outside the window.
There are some
and it's snowing.
Crows, and it's snowing.
And they're just like yapping about the snow.
Yeah.
Can y'all hear that?
Can you hear that, folks?
You know who would never once mention crows or the fact that it was snowing in his novels?
Mm-hmm.
Edgar Allan Poe.
Dostoevsky, because he never talks about anything outside of the minds of his characters. That is a fact that a lot of critics pointed out, and I was like, yeah. Once I thought back about his books, you're right. You never feel like you're there. You have no clue what it would be like to live in that town.
He's all interior, and yet
What town?
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, what?
And yet, I don't think he's a good psychologist. I don't think he has a good understanding of how character actually works. It'd be one thing if it was Jane Austen, where she never explains where you are. Like, it's just like, it's another walk on another property somewhere that's probably pretty, like...
You fill in your own blanks.
You fill in your own blanks, but she's one of the best psychologists ever to put pen to paper. But
yeah.
Anyway, we'll get to it. I'm Nathan. That's Brandon. That's Jake. This is the Bookening. Brandon sounds like this.
Hey, so that guy that I was talking about last time, David Bentley,
yeah,
he talks about the same thing. He says that people talk about Dostoevsky being a psychologist, and Nietzsche even said he was the best psychologist he had ever read. He said this is just bad. For one, he had disagreed.
Nietzsche went out of his mind, so he would know.
Yeah, and that's basically what he said. He said that these are people who mistake psychology for the extremes of how we think and feel. Like, as long as something makes it feel extreme, then therefore it's psychological.
Well, I'll just get my hot take on all this. Psychology is a mix of gets the ideas and the assumptions that we bring. Those are the yeast, but then there's like the flour that is our feelings and our childhood, and then there's the salt, and you put it all in there and you bake it up and you have a bread that is your psychology. But the way that Dostoevsky thinks about it is so reductive. The character has this idea like there is no God, and so therefore he commits an action.
1-to-1.
A to B. And it's like, no.
We don't make sense. We're not that rational.
No, yeah.
Nobody is that rational. Nobody entirely thinks their way to their actions. It's not how it works, for one. For two, Dostoevsky is everybody, his assumption about humanity is so
stupid,
simplistic, right? Like his understanding even of original sin and depravity, he understands a fundamental thing. We're sinners and guilty. But that runs in exactly one direction for him. And that direction is, therefore, nobody has any self-control and is completely given over to decadence. Mm-hmm. And so everybody fits into this one channel.
Yeah.
And that's not how original sin works. That's not how the doctrine of total depravity works.
But Alyosha and Father Zosima.
Well, his heroes are so insipid. If Alyosha was actually a boss, like if Alyosha had some spine, if Alyosha was a good character, it would change this novel.
It is interesting because Alyosha actually, we talked in context about how this was part one of a series for him. As far as they can tell from his notes, I didn't confirm this, but I took a class a while back when we read Anna Karenina, actually, in this class. He talked about Dostoevsky. This professor wasn't a big fan of Dostoevsky either. And he said that it's interesting to point out and realize that scholars think that his intentions for Alyosha was for Alyosha to kind of lose his faith.
Yay.
Of course.
Yeah.
That's the clear setup. That's what you expect to happen.
Maybe to get it back again,
novel.
But Alyosha was going to kind of mirror Dostoevsky's own.
Well, the Grand Inquisitor, I think, is the perfect Dostoevsky in miniature. And what you have there is the bad guys like, this is why God sucks. This is why church sucks. This is why, I'm sorry to be profane, but I'm not being any more profane than the Grand Inquisitor is, than Dostoevsky is. This is why everything's terrible. This is why there is no morality. This is why all conventional morality is wrong. And then Alyosha stands up and gives his brother a kiss. And the idea is, well, we still have to struggle forward with some kind of faith. But it's so insipid. It's so lame. Like the bad guy just made a very compelling, very poetic, very memorable argument. And the good guy's like, I can maybe do a thing.
That is the problem with Dostoevsky, and a lot of the way that people read him is that they see Dostoevsky as being that way to them, is that they're just as bad as Dmitri. They're just as bad as
Ivan,
Father Karamazov, as Ivan, and they're
Theodore.
just as smart and tortured. And Dostoevsky is understanding them and giving them a kiss, right? And saying, it's okay. I understand. It's fine, right? So he's an affirmation on their already existing affirmation of themselves.
You're seen and heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because most people who are like that in the first place, they already affirm themselves, right? And they think that's how they got there in the first place, is because they're so tortured and individualistic that nobody else gets them except themselves. And finally, they find Dostoevsky who gets them. And
yeah, but I guess if I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a second, if Dostoevsky was sitting here, he'd say, guys, I know, like, Ivan goes mad at the end. It doesn't work out for Dmitri. Like, you guys are criticizing me for the very thing I'm doing, which is showing where all this stuff ends up, actually. Like, when you embrace these philosophies, which were real things that have now corrupted the world, that were beginning to corrupt the world in my time, you reach a dead end. And that's what I'm dramatizing. And so you guys are taking the very thing, you guys are just saying back to me exactly what I tried to say to you.
And yet faulting me for it somehow.
And yet faulting me for it somehow. You talked on the last episode about the young man you knew who died. Well, I write stories about
if you're going to play the devil's advocate, Dostoevsky, what are you leaving me with at the end of all this? Dostoevsky, where are you taking me? What are you driving me toward? What is the point? Like, where is this going?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
give me something.
That's you write a good Joker. Who's your Batman? Like, what's the counterweight?
So you're just a nihilist. If that's the Joker, right?
Which,
like, if you write a good Joker and that's all you can do, then all you've told me is you're a nihilist, and you actually agree fundamentally with the Joker's point of view while pointing out the full horror of what would happen if we all actually embraced
Well, and what he would say is, to our finite minds, Jake, the Joker's point of view seems like the one that wins. And I don't know how to argue out of it, but I do know that I need to give that kiss, that I need to, in some existential way that doesn't really make sense to me, and it really doesn't make sense to you either, if you're being honest. I need to stand against it, and I need to be selfless, and I need to be love. And it doesn't make any sense to do those things, but I have to, and that's what faith is. That's faith. So,
and then I come back and say, well, that's exactly what we said was entirely bankrupt about your point of view.
Yeah, that's where we got him.
Like, if that really is your point of view, that's bankrupt. It's wrong. And so you actually didn't give us anything. That's not the answer, is to look at the pointless meaninglessness of it all and decide to give a kiss. You and Nietzsche and Camus can all die on that hill if you want to, but it's a dead end.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks for listening, everybody.
That's it. That's Dostoevsky.
Well, I actually did want to, I said last time I wanted to ask you a question, and this is probably a good lead into it. So I started out this podcast criticizing his take on psychology, which is also always A to B, and I'm going to exclude B through, B to Z. B to Z. It's all like if he wrote Pride and Prejudice, it would be like, Elizabeth Bennet posited that in a world without God, we must make our own judgments. And so therefore she judged Darcy, and that's the story. It'd be like,
well,
you're saying, well, it wouldn't be that? No,
it would be. And this is the point I guess I can make later when we talk about more of the specifics of the book. But you can definitely see, like, I in principle just agree with Nabokov's take on Dostoevsky. When he points out the fact that it seems like Dostoevsky really had a hard time getting away from the gothic sentimental novels he read a lot of. Like, criticisms of Dickens aside, Dickens at his worst falls prey to his sentimentality. Dickens at his best writes gloriously funny human comedies that get away from it. Dickens wasn't always prey to the worst of himself.
Right.
Dostoevsky seems to always typically be prey to the worst of himself.
When does he transcend it?
Who?
When and where does Dostoevsky transcend?
Yeah, I would say the closest he comes in this novel, and it's pretty close, is with Alyosha and the children. That's pretty good stuff.
But you would also say that's not just the closest he comes in this novel, that's the closest he comes.
That's the closest he ever comes. Crimes and
Because what you've consistently said, and I've not read read Dostoevsky's canon, but what you've consistently said or argued is that Karamazov is the closest he comes to that ever.
Yes, it is. Far as from what I've read of Dostoevsky, this is the closest he ever comes.
I think there are books where his narcissistic, existential, whatever, is more useful. Specifically, Notes from the Underground is a short, good book about that kind of man with a lot of insights that I think are helpful.
For two reasons: because it's short, and because he obviously doesn't like that man, right?
Yeah. And then there's
though people misread it and think that he's a big fan of that guy, right? But he obviously has a sort of disdain for that guy, which is useful because you don't want to be the person that he's disdaining.
Yeah. But if that was the only book he'd ever written, a little bit like, what's his face, only ever writing the novel Catcher in the Rye, I think, okay, well, I guess he had insight into this kind of guy. But then when he writes a book with all these characters and they're all that guy, I mean, I don't think I said this on mic. Maybe I did say this on mic. I forget. But I was going back over some old notes of mine from when I first read Brothers Karamazov. And the first thing that I wrote down was all the characters are Holden Caulfield. And it's really true. Like, everybody's the underground man. Even Alyosha in his way, even Zozima in their way. And if they're not...
Well, yeah, you have the weird scene where Father Zozima dies and...
just rots.
And what is Is it Radican?
I think it is Radican. It's Radican.
It's really, Radican. I think it is, or is Rakitin or something.
It's Rakitin, unfortunately.
It'd be funny if it was Radican. Though that might actually be taken from Rakitin.
Wouldn't shock me now that you mentioned.
But still, that weird scene where Rakitin comes up and is kind of his tempter, right? Asking him, why are you crying so much about Father Zozima and stuff? And all Alyosha can do is like give a wry, weird smile or something.
Yeah.
So.
But even Father Zozima, right? He killed a man.
Yeah.
And he's atoning for his guilt. Isn't that the story? Like, he killed a man.
Or he came close to it, right? He was going
to... No, his brother killed a man.
Yes,
Something
somebody killed a man.
His brother killed a man.
The point being, no character can ever really have it answer the Grand Inquisitor. We all just, the best we can do is give that kiss still.
And Father Zosima then went on to woo this woman who he found out actually wasn't in love with him, in love with this other guy. So then he challenges that guy to a duel.
Mm-hmm.
And they were going to fight, but then suddenly he has his mystic epiphany. And he's telling, and then he loses his credibility with his army friends, but he gains, it's the beginning of his path to being an elder.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so. and then why he likes and latches onto Alyosha is because Alyosha reminds him of a guy who killed a man and got away with it and then died.
Right.
Yeah.
This is just all this tangled.
So even Zosima was Holden Caulfield and is only just barely sort of figured out how to pretend not to be Holden Caulfield for a while.
Right.
And Alyosha feels like Holden Caulfield, but really, really, really wants to not be Holden Caulfield. So yay him. But this leads to the question or go ahead.
Sorry.
The only way that Zosima transcends Holden Caulfield is because Zosima is one of the few people that recognizes that everybody's just Holden Caulfield, and it's his job as somebody who's sort of, kind of, maybe transcended Holden Caulfield to be the confessor for all the Holden Caulfields of the world.
Yeah.
But even then, he's not going to take the fascinating thing about all the good guys and all of Dostoevsky is they never take a hard line against the bad guys. You know, it's never like, I'm going to stand up to you, Father Karamazov, because you're a terrible, vulgar, coarse, blasphemous man. It's more like, I'm going to bless you and take it from you because that's what a Christ-like figure has to do.
Because your guilt's my guilt, and we all share the same guilt, and I am just...
Right.
It takes that sort of spiritual reality of next to God, we all stand comparatively condemned, but it doesn't acknowledge any kind of actual comparative righteousness that is necessary for real justice, real mercy, and real functioning human relationships in the world.
Well, yeah, like functionally, if somebody, Jake, you're a pastor, this kid walks into your office, I'm looking at pornography. You tell him, you need to stop.
Right.
Pastor Dostoevsky, well, I looked at a lot of pornography, but God still sort of, there's faith or something.
Even though I've never looked at pornography, you're looking at pornography as my own looking at pornography.
Yes, in a way we all look at pornography.
Yeah, and your womanizing and adultery is my womanizing and adultery, and it's all the same. And
Let me embrace you.
Let's sort of just like equalize and spread around our guilt so that it's never like, actually, you worthless father and adulterer and philanderer, you need to be disciplined and punished. And because you're causing harm.
You never just say, well, I'm the pastor, and by God's grace, I have the moral high ground now, and so I'm either going to help you or discipline you or whatever, but we are not actually on equal footing, nor should we be.
Which I was doing some reading, and somebody made that same point. I don't remember who it was now, but they basically said that in his orthodoxy, Dostoevsky actually ends up being less of a Christian in his mindset than Tolstoy can
100%.
Be in his weird, because Tolstoy's more of like the free Protestant who has a view that sin exists, but he has a healthy view of it, and he has a real view of what it's like to be judged in this life and in this world. So Anna Karenina, she gets real judgment, but there's also still sympathy for him too, right?
Yeah.
So he can both have sympathy for a sinner, but also allow there to be consequences.
Exactly. And Dostoevsky does the same thing that lots of immature people do, which they can't separate the condemnation of sin and forgiveness of sins from consequences of sins.
Yeah.
And acknowledge that there is some kind of separation there. And so it's like we all equally bear the condemnation and the consequences, and all equally don't. In this like weird,
in a weird
confused way,
it lets the Father Karamazov and characters like that off the hook.
It lets them off the hook.
They're really not as bad as anyone. Everyone else is we're all that bad, and therefore nobody's that bad.
Yeah, in
there's no real villains in Dostoevsky.
A lot of like modern neo-Calvinistic pietism does the same exact sort of thing. It's like, just because, yes, we are all depraved. Yes, Romans 1, 2, and 3 nails us all to the wall. That doesn't mean that we look at the father who's molesting his daughter and 15-year-old boy who slipped and looked at porn the exact same way. Mm-hmm. They're not the same.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you get pastors saying, covering up those kinds of sins under the rug instead of exposing them and dealing with them and bringing them to light and justice and protecting the weak and the vulnerable.
Yeah.
Yes, forgiveness is offered equally to the father who's molested his daughter and to the 15-year-old who's looked at porn. But consequences are not dealt out equally and ought not be.
Yeah, there's a sort of bloody pagan asceticism to it. I mean, the ascetic views gave rise to the elders in Russia, but that's sort of like the flagellant position of the monks in the Middle Ages, where every small sin deserved just bloodying up your back with with a whip.
Mm-hmm.
It's depraved because it does think that it has no perspective on things, no accurate perspective on things.
Yeah, what I feel like with Tolstoy is his characters are always on this carousel, and they'll come around. Somebody like Pierre or Levin will come around to the Dostoevsky point of view for a chapter or two.
Yes,
but then life will move on. They'll mature, and then maybe they'll actually hit it again. But with the Dostoevsky character, the carousel's just broken, and the fair is deserted, and there's a sad clown smoking a cigarette.
They're stuck on that carousel from...
and they're just sitting there. And it's like, Tolstoy gets that. I mean, Pierre has that redemptive, weird, flagellant kind of moment where he, or more than moment, where he goes to assassinate the guy, and then he becomes a prisoner, and then he loses all the weight. And he becomes kind of this Christ figure. I mean, it's a very Dostoevsky kind of conceit, what ends up happening to Pierre. But then, like, real life happens to Pierre, and he gets married, and he has kids, and it keeps going.
Pierre doesn't stay there. He becomes Goofy Pierre, the husband, who's...
Do you think... it feels like Tolstoy does believe in some of that transcendence through suffering stuff, but...
Yeah.
He's always smart enough and psychologically real enough to have his characters not just land there, because nobody can realistically land there.
The best authors that we've read believe in transcendence through suffering.
Right.
The best books we've read all have, outside of Austen,
right?
Austen, an exception.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think of Tolstoy or Steinbeck or many of the best books that we've had, they all make that mistake.
Mm-hmm.
Either in big ways or small ways, but there's also much more to them than that. They transcend their limited idea of transcendence. It's not just suffering is the catharsis that we all must endure in order to atone for our guilt.
Mm-hmm.
Or worse, suffering is the catharsis we all must embrace to atone for our guilt. There's more to it. But there is nothing that is that's the sine qua non, that's the be-all, end-all for Dostoevsky. Suffering cathartically to atone for your sins and the sins of the people around you. This is the way.
Right. Yep.
And doesn't life suck?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's not, goodness, it's not to diminish the real importance
Are you saying we don't have to take up our cross,
exactly,
Jake?
Right? Like 1 star. Suffering is how God makes us aware of our sin and the sin of the world. Suffering is how, when we've turned to Christ, suffering is how we and are sanctified. It's a part of the process, and it's not the end in and of itself. It's not about wallowing in suffering. It's about striving for holiness and putting to death your sin and learning to walk in newness of life, which can be done in any number of contexts, especially in the context of real suffering.
Mm-hmm.
There can be joy and life and hope in the midst of real suffering, not a morose, navel-gazing suffering as the end that we're trying to attain.
Right.
Small-minded. It's very small-minded and very, very immature. And I have a lot of sympathy and affection for everyone aged 12 to about 24 who is feeling that. But outside,
we've all been there.
We've all been there, and I lived there longer than all of you, and that's why I hate it so much. So forget it. But
yeah, that's the thing.
Grow up.
That's the thing that drives me nuts about doing these podcasts. Is I'm afraid somebody's going to listen and be like, "Well, you guys just don't get it," and I don't know what to say to that. Besides, yeah, we do. I mean, we've had.
We do.
Oh, yeah. I don't want to tell the stories. It would be helpful to tell the stories, but you probably listen to those.
It's ugly and awful and sad and embarrassing and painful to tell all those stories. But they're real. been there, done that.
We've all had our...
Yeah, it's awkward and it's awful. And
I mean, there are two ways that you can hear us talking about this. We've been there, done that, lived it, and therefore we hate the idea that this man wants to trap you there and tell you that this is the height of self-knowledge and understanding of the world and God and the way God made the world and what God demands and requires of you.
Yep.
Or you can say, oh, these are just a bunch of glib idiots, in which case, turn us off. But I don't think you've been listening to anything we've ever said before. So,
Yep.
There you go.
Sorry, I'm just going to keep putting my gun to the head of any discussion because it's not what I'm trying to do, but it's just I don't know how to talk about this without wanting to put my gun to the head of
it's
of this stuff and blow it to pieces because I think it's so destructive. I don't know that I've come across anything that we've read that has been so central to the utter degradation, death, despair, and sexual ruin of people I've known and loved than Dostoevsky. There's not any other author, there's nothing I've ever seen or come across or that we've come across in this show that has been so directly tied to people dying and molesting their children and raping people and overdosing on drugs. It's just the absolute depravity that you can allow yourself to justify and embrace by living here is off the charts.
Yeah.
Well, I really think precisely because it's in a novel form, it's that much more destructive. That sort of person reads Nietzsche, for example. It's horrific what it can do to them. But there's nobody that picks up Nietzsche that doesn't kind of know that's what it's doing a little bit, even if it's just in the...
At least Nietzsche tells you
the depths of their heart. Yeah, he's like, God is dead and we killed him, man. It's okay, I know what this guy's doing.
Deep.
Yeah. Or Schopenhauer or somebody like that, suffering is all that there is, man. At least you're taking poison when you read one of those guys. But Dostoevsky has this reputation among conservative Christians as a poet and a philosopher and someone worth listening to. You read, and I did this, an article on the Gospel Coalition about Brothers Karamazov, and it says, the great Christian writer, Dostoevsky. I'm like, why ain't nobody making that mistake about Nietzsche?
Right.
But we're supposed to take this seriously. We're supposed to grapple with the questions that the Grand Inquisitor brings up. That's supposed to be
the Grand Inquisitor says, wouldn't the world be better if Jesus had just given into the temptation of the devil and there'd never been an institutional church and we all just lived in a collectivist socialist society? Guess what? That's been tried. Dozens of millions and millions of people. It doesn't work. It's bad. It's wrong. The answer to that is no. And every wannabe profound college student who wants to ask that question, sorry guys, there's nothing profound about it. The question's been asked for 200 years. It's been put into practice, explored to no end. Stop reading Dostoevsky and pick up a history book.
So is there ever a point of life where Dostoevsky's appropriate? Is it good to read Dostoevsky to help you get through those questions in the first place?
Yeah, there's always going to be somebody out there who needs to be brought to some level of reality and existential crisis. So they have to deal with their own sin and the sin of the world and their own lack of self-control and their own decadence.
But I would say most mature people can read Ecclesiastes. They can read...
Maybe Ecclesiastes actually understands what faith is and hope, and you can sit down and read it in one sitting and get everything and more than the Brothers Karamazov has for you. And it's coming at you 5,000 different ways. It's going to come at you poetically. It's going to come at you metaphorically. It's going to come at you directly head on. What does Dostoevsky actually at the end of the day do that Solomon doesn't do?
You know who I think should read Dostoevsky actually? I think a mature Christian man who maybe doesn't have a lot of direct experience with the underground man, who actually hasn't suffered in these ways, but would like to understand a little something about the mindset. I think that person could do well to read Notes from Underground.
Notes from the Underground, sure. But I was going to say Solzhenitsyn or I mean,
Yeah, you could still do better, but I think I wouldn't begrudge that person probably.
Sure.
Reading.
And Notes from the Underground would be the one.
Yeah, because it's short and because it
gets there.
It's pithy, it's insightful, it gives you everything you need. I don't know, Brandon, you want to push back on this a little bit? You want to defend old Fedor?
Do I want to defend old Fedor?
You don't have to.
I'm trying to think where you would start. I mean, so I guess.
Yeah, I think you start with your context. I think you start with, hey,
this wasn't Marilyn Manson putting on makeup to pretend to be
exactly
a broken...
right. You can say that because you live in 21st century America and you grew up in the 90s.
This guy was
You've lived in
broken.
Disneyland, and so everybody that you know that's dealt with this sort of thing is somebody who's just a poser. It's not somebody who's grown up in Russia and has been actually had a gun put to the back of his head and sent off to an internment camp and had his father and mother die and his wife and his brother and his children all dead.
It's like,
you know what my answer to that is? Have you heard of this guy, the Apostle Paul? Beaten, stoned, whipped, chained, night and a day at sea, all the stuff that he lists out. And now let's go read Philippians out loud together and see what Philippians has to do with Brothers Karamazov.
Again, I say rejoice.
Again, I say rejoice. I have learned the secret of being content in every circumstance, whether I have plenty or I have need and hunger and thirst, and it just doesn't matter. Rejoice. Again, I say rejoice. Like you would not...
Someone might...
He comes to faith in Christ and all his friends try to kill him. And he gets let down over the wall in a basket. And that's the beginning of what it means to be a Christian for the Apostle Paul. And he ends up being beheaded in Rome. Come on. If this is life, the Apostle Paul has no idea what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry if it sounds trite to you, but actually the Bible does call us to more and offer more to us than sitting around and experiencing some kind of guilt catharsis. It's...
Well, for one thing, it offers a robust picture of good, which is so lacking. I mean, that's almost a trite thing to say. It's
lacking in this book.
Yeah, it's... I mean, I hate Alyosha. I really hate that character.
Why?
Because he is a false picture of Christ. He is borderline blasphemous, I want to say, if not just fully blasphemous, because he is the Christ figure in the book, and it's because he turns the other cheek. It's because he looks the other way. It's because somebody comes at him with the Grand Inquisitor and he kisses that person, which is exactly what the Christ figure in this poem, the Grand Inquisitor, does. And that is such a false view, such an insipid, small-minded view of who our Savior was. Our Savior was...
Dickens and all of his sentimentality would have done better.
Oh, Dickens would have done a million times better.
Yeah, Dickens did better, yeah.
Dickens did do better. Dickens' Christ figures like Sidney, what's his face?
Well, spoiler.
Yeah, spoiler. Dickens' Christ figures are better. They're like dudes who are like, I'm making a choice because I have agency. I mean, Alyosha, at the very least, can you give me that a Christ figure should have agency? That Jesus Christ is coming back with a sword, that he came intentionally, that the Father God sent him, that he, everywhere he goes, every vignette, every story, every parable, it's like Jesus comes
Jesus came to make war.
Yeah, exactly.
And he did. Mm-hmm. He dethroned the principalities and powers of this world.
But there's a reason I'm not even going there, because I don't know if we want to start there. I want to say, can you just give me that Jesus, like, did things? Can you give me that much? Because the Alyosha, it's like, he's a Christ figure. It's the same thing with the idiot in The Idiot, whatever that guy, Prince Mishkin or whatever his name is. It's the same thing. It's the same place that Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment ends up at the end of the book. Is like, once you've become a man of faith, it means you're a man who looks the other way at evil, who doesn't actually stand up to it, a man who just lets himself get slapped around. And what I'm not saying is, in order to truly be a Christian, you have to self-actualize. What I'm saying is, well, I'm saying what Jake was saying. We have a God who is making war.
Can you imagine how impotent David would be if he had been fed Brothers Karamazov?
King David, you mean?
King David.
Yeah,
King David. Can you imagine how impotent King David would have been? how impotent Moses, how impotent.
Actually, we all have our Goliath. In some ways, we all are Goliath. So I don't know what we should do.
I mean, just think.
Go kiss Goliath.
I mean, there is. Okay, well, I think we're actually coming to it, which is the utter complete. The assumption of the absence of self-control and utter decadence is really an assumption of effeminacy.
Mm-hmm.
And the utter effeminacy that's at the heart of this sort of navel-gazing, gross, it's gay as all get out. And you cannot, can you imagine giving this book to a young man and then having him come away like, yeah, I'm gonna man up. I'm gonna deal with my sin. I'm gonna marry a woman. I'm gonna raise a family, and I'm gonna have some ambition and take on the task of filling and subduing this earth and calling people to God's kingdom.
And it's not just that he won't get that lesson; it's that he will get a lesson that contradicts and despises
undermines
that
every aspect of that.
It's like don't take any kind of responsibility. You shouldn't. The best that it's passive. I mean, it's like Christ-likeness is equated with passivity, and that's where Raskolnikov ends up. That's where Alyosha ends up.
And if you think
Prince Michigan starts there,
and he never has to grow anywhere.
So then, if you think that this has that kind of spiritual utility, well, what is it? Come on, man. Who do you think? Like, what's your view of what it means to be godly? What's your view of what it means to be a man? What's your view of what it means to walk in repentance?
Mm-hmm.
You don't have a view of repentance. You have a view of wallowing in your filth and feeling bad enough about it. That's it. That's gay. Well, sorry.
If I was decadent enough esthete, I am decadent enough esthete that I could probably enjoy this book if it was entertaining. Then, like, if it was all those things, it was just like fun, I'd be like, okay, well, this is crap, but I'm enjoying it. You know, I mean, I like Proust. I like stuff that's decadent and effeminate, but
me too.
You know, like
me too,
but good.
But this is trying to make you feel bad about it at the same time,
right? Here's something of no nutrition and it tastes bad.
Yeah. Huh. Well, everybody, we love Dostoevsky.
I blame Jake on this one. He's leading the charge.
I couldn't help it, man. I'm sorry.
This might turn out to be our most controversial episodes.
Well, let's push back.
I don't even care.
You know, let me say this.
Should we push back in a new episode?
Yeah, I can push back on me all you want. I will be the bad guy. I don't care.
I think that we can push back some, but it actually requires digging into the book.
Yeah, well, we'll push back a little bit next episode. I want to ask you this question that I've been teasing the whole time.
Yeah, let's push back the next episode.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Let me ask you this question, though, because I am confounded by his view of psychology. This idea that I have an idea, therefore I will go act on it. Like, that's just so stupid to me. Like, nobody acts like that. Nobody thinks like, I have a philosophy, therefore that's who I am. No, we have like desires and temptations and what we ate for breakfast. It's like...
And our desires and temptations impact what we believe, and then we try to hold them in opposition to each other, and then we end up doing what we do.
We tell ourselves one thing, we're destined, if you want to put it that way, to do another. There's so much that goes into who makes a person, and the way that Dostoevsky looks at it is so reductive. I mean, if Dostoevsky, I said the thing about Pride and Prejudice earlier, if he wrote Anna Karenina, it would be like, Anna posited that morality was not absolute when it came to sex, and so therefore she had sex with
whomever she pleased.
With Vronsky. It's like, that's not why Anna did that. She did it because she wanted something, because her husband was this way. Like, there's a million reasons why Anna did that. And Tolstoy captures every one of them brilliantly, but it wasn't just she had this one driving thing that she... So my question is...
Yes.
Here's my question.
Your question.
That I've been
We're coming to it.
Yeah. Is it just Dostoevsky being a little weirdo, a skeezy little weirdo, that he writes people like that? This is the dump on Dostoevsky episode. The next one, we're going to say how great he is. Or is there in fact something to the Russian character? This is my question for you, my kind of context question for you, Brandon. And we need to talk about our baggage, by the way, although I think Jake's given us some baggage.
I don't have any baggage. What are you talking about?
What baggage? I'm thinking about all those novelists you mentioned that were writing in the kind of flowering of the novel in the 18th century, your Eliots and your Austens and your Thackeray's and your Dickens and people like that in different cultures, or even Flaubert or Balzac or anybody that you could name. They don't do that. They present full portraits of the way that human psychology works, and their characters don't tend to obsess about ideas. But you read Russian literature, and Dostoevsky most of all, but even in something like Tolstoy, Pierre and Andrei and people like that are trying to process their life through these big philosophical ideas. The characters of Jane Austen, of George Eliot, of Dickens, of Flaubert, of anything you could name, they're not really processing their lives principally through philosophy. But in the great Russian novels, both Tolstoy, sorry, this is a long place to get to an obvious question maybe, but they're processing their lives through these ideas. And I was just wondering, is there something about the Russian character or about the Russian situation that made it that way? Or is it just that those were two weirdos that thought about things that way?
It made it where Dostoevsky would do it that way?
And where Tolstoy would do a better job, but still like Pierre's thinking about himself in opposition to all these ideas that were floating around.
Oh, I think
which you actually don't get in most English literature of the time. You kind of
get it in Middlemarch.
A little bit, but not quite the same way. Like in a
theory.
Where they're actually thinking about these great thoughts and great ideas. And
I mean, Middlemarch, it's like that's one element, but there's so much more that has to do with just who they are and the emotions and the experiences that they bring to it. In Russian literature, the idea looms large.
Yeah.
In psychology. Yeah, I don't know.
Like they're more philosophical.
Yeah, maybe that's all I'm saying. Why are Russians so dang philosophical?
French has some influences like that in it as well. I don't know if you ever read any Balzac, but it has some of that element to it, or Flaubert even. Flaubert, not as much, actually.
But Flaubert, like Madame Bovary, right? And in that story, she reads a bunch of stuff, and she thinks, wouldn't it be great to be this kind of courtesan, free spirit kind of person? But you understand that she's not motivated to become Madame Bovary simply because she read a book. She's motivated because that's who she is.
Can I try to answer this question and jump in on it?
Sure.
Because I have.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear your theory.
The Russians had an identity crisis. They had a cultural crisis. And that cultural crisis created an identity crisis. Are they Asia or are they Europe? Do they want to be Europe or what? They weren't included in the Reformation. They're not downstream of it. They're not included in the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
They're downstream of it, and they're getting it imported instead of it being an organic product. So they're hitting up against foreign concepts and foreign ideas and foreign culture and having to process themselves through the lens of a foreign culture that has flowered and blossomed and produced great art and great law and great civilizations. And they have to deal with their own envy. They have to deal with their own insecurity, and they have to process themselves always in relation to all these other things that have in some way self-actualized and assumed their own greatness. Nobody in England is questioning the greatness of the way England thinks or views the world. England's just great. In France, you would have a little bit more of that because they're going to be hitting up against the Spaniards and the Russians.
Yeah.
And the Germans. So you'll have a little bit more of that. But the French, they know who they are, and they think they're really great. And they have no envy of the Russians or anybody else.
Huh.
And so it's not causing an identity crisis for them or a cultural crisis. Whereas when we go back to the context that Brandon laid out for us, so much of even the Russian novel is a function of Russians having made their way to Paris and then been like, oh crap, they're actually kind of better than us here. And what does that mean for us? And can we integrate with Europe? And so it's just all a function of this sort of like cultural crisis and identity crisis that they're all dealing with. So of course they're going to be more philosophical, and they're going to try to hit up and project, even as they are hitting up against these ideas, project that onto Europeans that simply take this sort of thing for granted and don't actually operate that way. They've read their way into European culture. They've not lived it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think somebody like that, it's very human nature to the more unsure of yourself you are, the louder you talk about how sure of yourself you are. So if you don't really know what your identity is, then you're like, this is my identity. No, this is my identity.
And see, look, I understand the philosophy better than the philosophers. And I understand the way that the rational mind works. I too am enlightened.
It's a little bit like the mawkish sentimentality that the Victorians had about children, which we've talked about before. What a brutal age for mistreating children. But they're like, children are great. Hooray for the angelic angels.
And I think in some ways it's like, if you want to, like, let me jump into Steinbeck, like for half a second. I think Dostoevsky hits all of that the way the dude who kills himself hits up against it in East of Eden. Remember?
Oh, the brother. One of Samuel's sons.
Yeah, one of Samuel's
He accidentally
sons.
kills his sister.
He accidentally kills his sister. He kills himself.
Yeah.
Right? Because he can't hit up against these things and not drown.
Right.
And so you have Dostoevsky who hits it and drowns under the weight of it.
Mm-hmm.
And you have Tolstoy who hits it. And not only does he float across the top of it, he's the world's ultimate cosmopolitan living at the exact right time. And all this cultural crisis and identity crisis conspires to make him this colossal cosmopolitan genius into the greatest author the world's ever known, with the most insight into human nature, because he's transcending cultures at a time of cultural crisis and revolution.
And in his real life, he eventually succumbs and drowns.
And in real life, he eventually succumbs and drowns. But in the process, he burns bright and brighter than anybody's ever burned.
Yeah. There you go. I think Jake gave you the answer, Nathan. Good job, Jake. That would have been my answer, but you did a lot better than I would have. So, well done.
This has been my there's my doctoral thesis.
Yeah,
guys.
Jake,
that's really good.
Came up with it on the fly.
What do they say? Loaded to bear? Is that the
loaded for bear?
Loaded for bear.
But yeah,
you got to load your gun ready to kill the bear.
Yep.
Right? So,
or if your grandpa drank a lot, he's your loaded for bear.
Yeah, I don't think I'd add anything to that. I think that Jake's right. I think it's both a function of their nation in relation to the rest of Europe and also their particular personalities coming into play there, because you had two guys who did end up being weirdos, right? Like Dickens just wanted to be a storyteller, right? And so in the end, that's what he did. He told stories.
Yep.
He's got some ideas ever occasionally thrown in there, but usually that's the weaker part of Dickens, right? Because he wasn't a thinker, but both these guys could have easily been historians or philosophers as well as a novelist if they had wanted to be.
And Tolstoy did want to be.
Yeah, and maybe Dostoevsky would have had a better time of it being like a dramatist, like people say, but still. Yeah, it was their particular personalities mixed with this crisis of trying to figure out Russian identity with the growing modernization of their culture and the cruelty of these emperors and trying to keep them from being able to I mean, it's the story of Russia that we even see today. Right? It's just, that's Russia. So, yeah. Spot on.
Look, it's the reason why Russia was the first to fall to Marx.
Yeah.
They had a cultural crisis. They had an identity crisis, and so they were primed.
Yep.
To just be taken in by a philosophy. And to embrace a philosophical way of looking at the world and purge themselves and try to get a fresh start and get a leg up and be a part of the next revolution.
Yep.
You take the pride and the envy together with the cultural crisis. Walls come down, statues come down, the streets get renamed, the culture gets destroyed, and we're trying to build something new. It's what primed. And anybody that understands that and actually understands how that revolution happens understands that if you're going to create that revolution or recreate it, you first have to create a cultural crisis and an identity crisis and prime the pump for the statues to come down and the streets to be renamed and for everybody to be ready to give up their culture and to burn the dissidents.
Yeah.
Right? And it's what happened in China, and it's what people are trying to do and have been largely successfully doing here in America for the past. It's been a longer project. It's a 150-year project, but it's a project.
Yeah. This is not a cooked thought. So I was trying to come up with some Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, their relationship to their culture at the time, and also then the way that they both progressed and the identities that they represent. It almost seems like Dostoevsky's sort of navel-gazing obsession with this fanaticism lends itself more to a nation that would go the way Russia went, while a Tolstoy would have inevitably been killed in a revolution as someone who had too much to see and to say.
This isn't a half-baked thought. This is a fully cooked thought. No, this is also a half-baked thought, or half-cooked. It's like I have not done a little bit of weed, nor have I done a lot.
just a modicum.
There's also something in Dostoevsky, I think, that Tolstoy came for more money than Dostoevsky, right?
Yep. Yeah, well, I'm pointing that out in context.
Yeah, exactly. So that's Dostoevsky has to always sort of be proving that he knows how to think in a way that Tolstoy can just comfortably.
Yeah. So one thing that's in the
have his characters talk.
So I'm thinking about Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence here, right? Russia's always obsessing about its own identity and its own. We're going to be Russian, and this is what it means to be Russian, because they're always actually really thinking about the fact that they're insecure, compared to Europe, right?
Yep.
And that's part of the Russian identity. So all the nobles in Russia, they both want to be European, but then you also have then this drive to want to find what it means to be Russian as well. And so, you see the tension and all throughout their literature and the fact that Europe does look down on them. I mean, it was a fact. Europe did, and to an extent still does. Mm-hmm. So,
and in many ways, always, kind of, rightly so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And out of that sort of crisis of identity, you get some of the best in the 1800s, and then into the 1900s, it would be music, but you get some of the best art that the world would have. Yeah. You get Tolstoy, and then you also get Tchaikovsky. And Stravinsky and those guys.
Insofar as the world doesn't look down on Russia, it's precisely because of these artists. I mean, Konstantin has translated these things, and people started to, oh, wow, Russian literature.
Look at this.
Look at this.
We all thought we were writing novels, but then that guy over in Russia just wrote Anna Karenina and War and Peace.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can all put our pens down and kind of
if we have a winner. Pencils down, folks.
Yeah.
Well, in that sense, if you want to pull out the redemption for Dostoevsky, all of that art was produced in the context of a kind of suffering that their European inferiors never experienced or walked through.
Mm-hmm. There's a way that Dostoevsky is helpful to someone in that context, in the sense that he almost, like if you're already in the middle of that suffering and you see it all the time around you, like with the Notes from the Underground, this is more true of that, and also Crime and Punishment. Yeah. You don't want to be those guys, right?
Right.
Yeah, except in Crime and Punishment, he does kind of hold off the redemption of the guy through the prostitute and everything as ideal.
It's great uplifting stuff.
Yeah. Notes from the Underground. If I'm not mistaken, you're not supposed to really hope that you're that guy, right?
Right. Yes.
Okay.
True.
Am I reading that right? But to a lazy, fat society in the West, they would look to that and they would be like, man, I kind of wish that in a perverse way, they would be like, I kind of wish that I had that Russian society so that I could be the oppressed demonic figure like that, right?
It's like people in the 90s watching the movie Train Spotting or something.
Yeah, and
we all want to be this grody part of the underground.
They don't really want it.
No, you wouldn't actually like it if you had to experience it.
But they like to imagine themselves that way.
Yeah, there's a romanticism to,
and there's a perversity. Yeah. If you're doing that with your art, then there is a perversity to it, right? If that's the way you're reading, that you wish that you could be in that sort of seedy situation, so you could be that character, even to the extent that you then imagine that you actually kind of are. Like, this is, as much as I don't like him, this is what that guy, that one American writer, I forget his name. He did American Psycho.
Oh, Bret Easton Ellis.
Yeah, he writes about that, right? Yeah. That American tendency to imagine a world that's grungy and evil just so that we can imagine ourselves like that, right? So it's Walter Mitty with a edge.
Yeah. I've got a pun, Walter, but I can't say it because it would be inappropriate for a Christian podcast, but it would have been brilliant.
I don't think you've left really anything to the imagination. So,
well, there you go. Make your own pun, folks. Do whatever you want with it.
No matter how Mitty they are.
But I think it's important what you said. Dostoevsky wasn't a poser. Whatever else he was, he lived this stuff.
He was a real madman.
He was a really broken dude. So you can give him that much, I guess. Although maybe Jake doesn't want to give him that. You want to give him that, Jake?
No, I did give him that when I was defending him earlier.
That's right. You did give him that. Yeah.
All also, right. Last one other detail that I never realized about him, and for some reason it stuck out to me. He was apparently really short. He was like 5'3".
Oh, that explains everything.
That shocks me. I always imagined him as
explains about all you. We could have just said that at the top.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I always imagined him as like a bigger Russian guy, right? With a wild beard and hair.
Yeah, it's funny. I imagine him as a weaselly, small, little kind of accountant kind of guy.
Well, you got it right on then, Nathan.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Your perspicacity. Once again, Does you honor.
My perspicacity once again did me honor, folks, and that's why we listen to this podcast, so you can hear my perspicacity do me honor. All right, we'll come back next time. Maybe we'll defend Dostoevsky a little bit.
No.
Dig in a little bit more.
I'm done with this guy.
Jake will be like, you know what, guys? I've decided Dostoevsky's great.
I will say that I have a feeling that this is either, like for our fans are going to love this episode. For everyone who has a bone to pick with us, we're going to get bones picked at us for this episode. So,
yep, I think that's true. And speaking of bones, our patrons have what, 288 apiece,
and they've thrown them all at us.
How many bones does the average person have?
I don't know, Nathan.
They don't have any bones to pick because they love us, they support us, and I will now
add over what, 1,500 bones a month.
Yeah, exactly. Once again, please get us to 2K bones so that we can start to give Brandon a little bit of well-deserved money. That'll get you Ready Player 1. 2. I always say that wrong. That'll get you Ready Player 2. And sometime, hopefully early this year, you'll be getting some King Arthur because you got us to 15K. Now, let me read the patrons, and why don't you guys say which, you could take turns saying which candy this patron reminds you of. Robert and Rhonda the Lovebirds.
Frankenstein.
The Artful Anthony Dodger.
Dracula.
Yes.
Little Anthony's Cigar Store.
Frankenstein.
The Immortal Chelsea E.
Dracula.
I feel like a theme is emerging here. I feel like we've done this before. Stuck in some kind of hellish existential loop. Can't get out of it. It's breaking my mind. I am the sick man. I am an underground man.
No.
No, I'll just turn the other cheek. I'll just let you guys do it because that's what a true Christian does. The Immortal Chelsea.
Frankenstein.
Little bit Jimmy Beam and Little Annie Oakley.
Dracula.
Brendan really had to think about that one there. Lily of the Valley.
He almost said Fifth Avenue, but
the third monster. Andrew Ness with the Lovebirds. The Keith Master. David's Mighty Men Trucking. John
Dracula. Fairy Princess.
Jake's not dying. Jeremy the Dirk, Lord of Death. DJ Sammy G, Benny and Danny Spears. I can Catherine down the middle. President Lady X. Lavender's Green. Dylan. Noah Constrictor, Mara Chief, Farron Fragnant, Megan Chloe, Anthony's Golden Hates Life, Liberty in the Pursuit of Chief, Jiu-Jitsu Jeffrey, the Texas Ranger, Rachel. Midnight Ninja Ellen, Returning to the Diet, J.F. Rack and Ruin, Timothy the Rider at Dawn, Eric and Kate the Camp Champ, Dracula, Matt Man, Sweet Jamie Sunshine, Tyler the Keeper of Eternal Darkness, and Laura the Keeper of Eternal Light, Cold Steel Cody, Jack Clinton, the Librarian, Barbarian, John Bomb Diggity, Captain Daniel is me, Saxophone Alex, other Saxophone Alex, Debso Danny, Ryan Terror of Texas, Eric of Cream and Crimson, we're stuck in the cold, please send cheese,
Frankenstein.
Dracula.
Frankenstein.
Ben Solo and Kylo Ren.
Dracula.
Frankenstein.
Dracula.
It's like the Jackson Pollock painting of patron shoutouts. John, the Cosmic King of Chaos.
Frankenstein.
Dracula.
Matthew, the Mind Flayer.
Frankenstein.
Dracula.
Actually, I wrote down Matthew, the Mind Flarer. I don't know what that means, but
he's got flair.
He's got flair. Annie, are you okay? Get your gun.
Frankenstein.
That's the best one ever. Dracula.
That is a good one.
Almost is the Camp Kings or whatever.
The Camp Kings.
You remember that one?
The Warm and Love Beast.
Yeah.
Oh, man. We were tired that day.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Goodbye, folks.
Good night.